Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. It's the time of year when people wear red poppies in the lead up to Remembrance Day, the 11th of this month. The wearing of the poppy commemorates the sacrifices of those who've lost their lives in war, while the accompanying appeal raises money to support the veterans and their families. There are many Muslims who support the wearing of the poppy, especially to remember the sacrifices of the many Muslims throughout the Commonwealth who have fought and died for Britain in various wars. However, the wearing of the poppy has, in recent years, proven controversial. In the context of recent wars, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, where for many the British soldier has been part of an occupying rather than a liberating force, the poppy symbol has become part of a campaign to glorify military campaigns. So should we remember the military dead as well as civilians? And should we include children and others who've lost their lives in the conflicts? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Afzal Amin, a former British Army officer with 11 years of service in both Iraq and Afghanistan, retired Major Hugo Clark, who's the Programme Director of the World War I Commonwealth Contribution Project at the Curzon Institute, Albert Beale from the Peace Pledge Union. It's one of the organisations that was originally involved in the promotion of the white poppy since the early 1930s. And on the phone we have Mozam Beg, who's Director of the Muslim rights organisation Caged Prisoners. Welcome to the programme, all of you. So I guess the first thing we should do is to kind of establish for viewers what the poppy appeal and the wearing of the poppy means to you. I mean, Albert, obviously you've launched an alternative to it, so you're not accepting the story that usually goes with it.
I think for pacifists, and indeed not only for pacifists, but for other peace campaigners and for other people, the red poppy often means that you're trying to put a spin on war which not just looks back at past wars, but accepts the idea of future wars. And as a pacifist, the only logical approach for me to mourning the dead of war is to say that regret at the past misery has to go along with a 100% commitment to renounce and reject all future wars. If you're marching around at the Cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday like the military chiefs and the politicians are, and you're looking very mournful wearing your red poppies, you go back to your office on the Monday morning to plan the next war, that to me is hypocritical.
But this is a distorted view of the reality, and I think all soldiers would be the first to say we abhor war. War is an utterly abhorrent activity. It's the worst of human activities. I think there's no one in the military who joins saying war is a great thing.
They shouldn't take part in it then, should they?
But the thing is that, we can say that today in 2013 in London because we don't face any existential threats. But when you've got a rising power in Europe that's conquering country after country, committing massacres and massacring millions of people, what do? A pacifist approach is to do nothing and wait for their invasion forces to come to you. Whereas what we're talking about here is defending your nation, defending innocent people. And there are many good people, my great-grandparents, my own grandfather was in World War II, who step forward and say, we are going to step forward and defend those who can't defend themselves. And all the red poppy does, it symbolises that people before us died, and as a result of their sacrifice, we enjoy the freedoms that we do today. And that's all it is. It is not a celebration, it's a commemoration.
Okay, let me bring Mozam Beg in now. Mozam, obviously, you've got a kind of different take on this?
Well, look, let me just say clearly, my grandfather, his brothers and his father before that all served in the British Army and served in all various conflicts from the Boer War, the Frontier War, the World War II and World War I. But never in our family ever have we celebrated or remembered their memory by wearing poppies. We are Muslims first and foremost, so we celebrate and remember our dead through Islamic tradition and through Islamic principles. The second thing here is that nobody has anything against those who wear poppies to remember the dead of the First World War and Second World War. What we do take issue with, what I do take issue with, is that the fact that these wars, the very wars that we're talking about protecting people, in fact, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, beaten, tortured, murdered and raped, that we're in fact celebrating the soldiers who've been involved in some of that too, because the British Legion says very clearly that it is to commemorate people who fought in the wars past and present. Now, the present wars that are taking place very clearly have been in contravention to basic human rights. And in fact, they're not seen as the protectors in those lands, they're seen as the aggressors, and have caused so much misery that to this day, we are living the results and the effects of the war on terror that people in the Muslim world largely believe has been waged against their faith and their body and their lands.
Mozam, I know you're short of time, so thanks very much for joining us. Hugo, do you find that there's a greater difficulty for the public accepting this when it's about Iraq and Afghanistan than it might be about the Second World War?
I think for certain members of the public, yes, but I think that the military in the last 10 years has perhaps been disassociated with political decision within the areas of conflict where we have been operating. And that has been thanks, I believe, to many of the charities who've been working hand in hand with the military over the last 10 or so years. I think one has to look at the type of people who are joining the army and who are working within the army. You can't make a kind of, you can't label a soldier. A soldier could be from a broken home in Glasgow, needing a roof over his head. He could be someone who has got an archaeological degree from a great university. He could be someone who has travelled to this country from Jamaica or from Pakistan or other such places. All of these people are soldiers, and all of them live under the same roof. And I think we've picked up two words so far which have been resounding in my head: celebration and commemoration. To me, the poppy is a personal thing, very personal. It is about commemoration. There's only one colour of blood, and that is red. And to me, that puts everybody under that same colour. Everybody who has operated within these conflict zones. And yes, the poppy was brought in because of the poppy in Flanders Field. It was brought in because of the huge sacrifice which happened across Great Britain and the significant contribution from the Commonwealth nations in the First World War. But the transcendency of that has gone far and beyond that. And if I look at myself as a white Anglo-Saxon Christian who has been operating within the army beside Muslims, beside Hindus, beside Sikhs. When I was out of the army, I worked for a charity called the Halo Trust, clearing landmines in Afghanistan, working with ex-Mujahideen up in the Hindu Kush, and I operated with them very openly.
Okay, let me bring Albin. Have you found that in recent years there's been a kind of a bigger take-up of the white poppy?
I think there has been, yes. I mean, I think there is an increasing unhappiness amongst many people, and not far from only pacifists, with the way that the military and the politicians use things like remembrance and ceremonies such as that, which are very emotional, as a way of providing political backup for the forces, particularly at a time when the forces are doing things which are less popular than they have sometimes done. And I just have to say that the mythology that pacifism is about doing nothing, it just rejects one particular form of struggle. It rejects mass organised armed slaughter. All other forms of 101 forms of non-violent struggle are still open to pacifists, and we pursue them all the time. So let's not say that we don't acquiesce to.
Sure, but I think there are many wider points to this.
Yeah, let me bring you back to a point that you made in the initial introduction, though, because I think many people, when they hear the comparisons made with, as you put it, an existential threat that existed to this country in the Second World War, they think that something is that a con's being worked on them, when the memory of that war is used to justify wars which, whatever you think of them,
it's never been used to justify subsequent wars.
That aren't even remotely an existential threat, and that most people in this country rejected.
Okay, sure. I mean, but first of all, I've never heard anyone use the memory of World War II as an excuse for the invasion of Iraq or the invasion of Afghanistan.
Then, because the Prime Minister of the day said that Saddam Hussein was a new Hitler, i.e. directly making the comparison.
Okay, that kind of, that may have been said, but the point I'm trying to make is that for people who are directly involved, or for civilians, or for anyone who's caught up in conflict, the wearing of the poppy and Remembrance Sunday are not acts of celebration. For me personally, there was a young man who grew up in Pakistan, who joined the British Army, who died in Sangin in 2006, called Jabron Hashmi from Birmingham. We buried him, we went to his funeral and so on. My platoon commander when I was at Sandhurst was killed in Afghanistan. A very good friend of mine called Sarah Feely, or Sarah Bright later on, was also killed in Afghanistan. So, for us who stand and we genuinely remember, we feel the sense of loss. And then, of course, there are, as we know, hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan who've died in these wars, and they are also remembered. And if you attend any remembrance parade event, you'll see whoever's leading it mention the civilians that are killed, and that is an act of great regret for everyone involved. And I've never 11 years in the military, the last 3 years as a strategist, I never heard anyone celebrate any civilian death. It's an act of great regret. And the militaries, American and British and all of NATO, do not systematically carpet bomb villages like they could, because they've got the capability.
They may not do it, but it is
well,
still the case. The majority of deaths in war are innocent civilians these days. Most people who get killed in war don't choose to be involved.
Which is abhorrent and of great regret.
And a modern phenomenon. But just let me bring Mozam in, because he's still with us. Mozam, do you feel that the kind of alternative form of commemoration, which the white poppy represents, is a more inclusive and effective way of commemorating people that lost their lives in war?
Well, you know, this whole discussion just seems to be about one side, but we're not talking about the other side. We're saying, well, we don't celebrate the deaths of civilians, but precisely that's exactly what's going on. The numbers of military dead in comparison to the number of civilian dead are absolutely minuscule in comparison. And yet we celebrate, and we know it's the majority, it's the military thing, it's the British Legion, it's the British government, it's the British Army that celebrates it. Do they celebrate, do they talk about, do they commemorate the death of Baha Musa, who was beaten to death by British soldiers? Do they commemorate the deaths of the people I saw with my own eyes beaten to death by US soldiers? Do they commemorate and talk about, or do they visit the families of people who were killed by the carpet bombing that some of your guests have said doesn't take place, which I witnessed with my own eyes, 15,000-pound daisy cutters, they're called, euphemistically, which were dropped all across Afghanistan, let alone the numbers of bombs that were dropped across Iraq. It's absolute complete nonsense, I think, when you're talking about military men saying that we just regret the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. I'm sorry, they're not just a statistic. They are human beings who've been killed en masse. And if you have the loss of your friends, one or two of them who are soldiers who signed up to fight, then what about the numbers of dead that you've killed who had nothing to do? They never signed up for the fight. They were massacred by an invading military who had no right to be in their country at all.
Hugo, isn't that the difficulty with the modern context, that these were not like the Second World War, a war forced upon us? These were wars of choice, and that the kind of results that the population is all too familiar with now, has actually turned the majority of people into people who don't support those modern wars.
I think there's always going to be debate about the conflicts which we've been operating in the last 10 to 12 years, and I think there will be continued debate in history to come over it. And I don't think it's my position to say whether that was a just war or not, and I don't think that's really been debated fully yet. I don't think that the inquiries have fully unearthed exactly what was right and what was wrong. And I think every side has a part to play here. But if we go back to why we're sitting here today, what that remembrance, what that commemoration is from our parts in those. And people have, again, been using the word celebration, and I think that's taken completely out of context. And when I go to remembrance service, and when I visit the families of those of my soldiers who have been killed, it's a very personal thing. It's very personal to me and to those families as to the sacrifice which has been made. And yes, that is our remembrance, that is our memory, that is our commemoration, that is how we handle the grief. And yes, we do think hugely, deeply about the tragic deaths which have occurred and which I've personally witnessed in, as has been mentioned about the daisy cutters, or actually their PF-1s, which were spread across Afghanistan by the Russians. You know, you can put sides on everything. You can put a spin on absolutely anything. And you could even say that actually a lot of the civilian deaths haven't been orchestrated by America, Great Britain, or other countries. They've been orchestrated by insurgencies within those countries which we've been operated in. So who's to blame? And we don't want to kill any innocent civilians at all.
Albert, let me just ask you a question. Do you think that one of the things that is going wrong here is that whatever you think, and I take the points that you've made earlier about opposition to industrialised warfare and whatnot, but do you think that one of the things that perhaps is going wrong is that the politicians are doing precisely the thing which Hugo and Afzal said that they shouldn't do? They are politicising the debate.
Well, I mean, yes, in a sense, when it said that there's no celebration, there's no sort of pushing forward a war mentality by the use of remembrance, well, there was a picture of some people from Royal British Legion just the other day had a picture of these kids with these big placard-sized poppies wearing T-shirts saying "Future Soldier." I mean, the whole way that the commemorations are used is in a way that justifies and perpetuates the idea of warfare.
I don't think that's for the
majority.
majority.
Let me just bring Mozam back in. I mean, Mozam, do you think that this is an example really where the kind of governmental culture has sort of departed from the sort of sensibilities of most people in this country?
Well, I think, just remember when this whole issue happened with these guys coming out and burning the poppies at, I think it was Wharton Bassett or elsewhere, and the furor that was around that. Now, nobody could respect that sort of behavior. Nobody likes the idea of destroying something that somebody else sort of holds sacred in a way. But at the same time, if you look on the other side, you have to recognize that while we've got our esteemed guests here saying that we think about and we commemorate also the dead of the other people, that's simply not true. How many Afghans and Iraqis whose families were massacred were brought over for the celebrations or commemorations or whatever you call it, whatever pedantic word you want to use? How many of them were brought over? How many of the relatives of the people that I mentioned, that I saw beaten to death myself with my own eyes, with his hands strung up above his head, being punched and kicked by allied US soldiers who were allied to the British, how many of their family members were actually brought over and said that we are also commemorating what our soldiers did to you? The answer is none. And no, but they take. But they take. Okay, but they took place.
Let him finish his point.
But they took place, and you're again in denial about the daisy cutters. I saw the daisy cutters landing. I saw the cruise missiles landing in Afghanistan, in villages, and killing entire populations or parts of populations. And to suggest it was the Russians who did it or nonsense like that, or to say that it was the insurgents doing that. Insurgents don't have B-52 bombers or F-16s or any of those combat aircraft, as you know. And that's precisely what I was talking about. They were being hit by British and American allied forces. I want to know how many of those villages from Granai village and elsewhere, how many of their relatives were being brought to the commemorations to be included in part of these services.
Let me just put that point.
That is a valid point. Yeah.
And do you think actually that the celebrations might or the commemorations might be strengthened if there were Afghan families who've lost people to Allied action were brought over?
It could be that way, but to suggest that somehow the remembrance of people who've died in war over the last 100 years or more can be the opposite side of individual soldiers committing war crimes that's what's nonsense. Exactly. The majority of foreign troops who've been in Iraq and Afghanistan that I've seen with my own eyes and worked and lived with aren't war criminals. They haven't committed war crimes. And yes, I recognise Mozam's point that many civilians were killed. I recognise, as the US government and the UK government do, that occasionally disproportionate force was used and civilians have been killed. I recognise all that. But us today saying that because those cases of wrongdoing or cases of illegality have occurred, we're somehow going to reject the whole idea of remembrance. I mean, this is not accurate.
Let me just ask you about the whole politicisation question, because, I guess when you get down to it, most people are never going to say that we shouldn't commemorate people who've lost their lives. There's, an absolutely tiny minority of people who would ever hold that kind of point of view. But when the government is gearing itself up for, what can only be described as a propaganda effort around the anniversary of World War I next year, people feel a bit sick in their stomach, I think.
I don't think it is. I think some people will view it as a propaganda one because they want to view it as a propaganda effort.
No, but when David Cameron is making speeches about this, saying next year and we've got the First World War wrong and it wasn't a terrible disaster and so forth, you've got to be politically insensitive not to figure out that something's going on here.
I don't think that's what he's saying. I think from listening to various government departments who I've been working beside in the last few months, the message I've been getting from them is we are in a position now where we are writing history for future generations, and we must make sure that nothing is brushed under the carpet. We must ensure that the real story is told about what happened in the First World War, not only from the immense sacrifice from across the Commonwealth and the contribution from the soldiers there, but on the home front as well, and what happened to those soldiers when they returned to their country, what happened with the mass poverty, what happened with the mass unemployment, what happened to a lot of those countries going into bankruptcy, etc. And one has to look at that true story to define history for all of us, to establish if we had links of forefathers, of great-great-grandfathers, of great-great-grandmothers who helped on the home front. And that's really important to establish those links. And so each person, each community can take something back with them and then decide themselves what they want to commemorate. And I think that's the important thing. It's got to be down to the individual, the family and the community for themselves to decide what they want to be commemorating over the next 4 years.
Do you think that is the picture that we're going to get here? I mean, there was an absolutely huge mutiny in the British Army. Do you think that's going to be part of the celebrations?
I shouldn't think it will be. I mean, there's so much being brushed under the carpet. I mean, for instance, one thing that doesn't figure in the governmental plans for next year, but which others of us are working around, is the fact that there were thousands of people who didn't take part in the war, but who resisted the war. There were 16,000 conscientious objectors in the First World War, some of whom were condemned to death. They were all sentences were commuted. And when the PPU, my organisation, got a grant recently to help do some research on that with local history projects, there was shock horror front page stories in the right-wing papers saying, isn't this awful? Why look back at conscientious objectors?
Is that the same area where the BBC has been commissioned with government support to do a programme on?
I've no idea.
I think it is.
So one point I'd like to make very quickly is that Remembrance Sunday or Remembrance Day and the wearing of the poppy and the history that we share explains a number of very important modern things. The first one is the diversity of our nation. How is it that we have such a range of ethnic minorities and white British people and people from a range of religious backgrounds all living on this small island? Something happened in human history that after thousands of years of very little ethnic diversity in these isles, suddenly within 100 years we have the diversity that we do, which is becoming increasingly diverse. And what was that event? And that was, of course, World War I and World War II, and then the labour that came afterwards as a way of rebuilding the country. So that explains to some of the young British Muslims that Mosim's talking about, what they're doing in this country and how they belong to the history of this country. And it explains to people like the EDL and the BNP that the reason why we have this diversity is because our great-grandfathers fought side by side against a common enemy. And because of that inheritance, we have the freedom that we do today. And we must commemorate that. At the 100-year point, where there are no more survivors, surely I should be telling my son that you live in this great country because of this history. I mean, that's something we should welcome.
And finally, we're just moving to the end of the programme now, Hugo. Do you think that the kind of celebrations that you're talking about will actually be as inclusive as this, or do you think it's going to be a Tory ramp towards the next election, which is what a lot of people fear?
I think they're going to be inclusive. I think you've got funding coming from a lot of different sectors, including the Heritage Lottery Fund, and I think that, and you've got many different angles which may not have been considered in the outset, which are now being considered. And I believe that in my dealings with 4 to 5 government departments, they have turned around and said, we need to tell the truth. We cannot brush things under the carpet. And that is from their mouths. And so I am delivering 50 lectures across the country, starting from later on this month. We're launching tomorrow. And we will be going into communities and schools and delivering the message of developing the understanding of how much contribution, the significant contribution which Commonwealth countries gave at that time.
It's only because we're just coming to it, so I want to get a final point from Albert. What do you think should be said in a sentence about the First World War?
The first and last thing that always should be said when looking back at war is no more war.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave it. So do rejoin us for the second part of analysis.